Phantasm, the delusion of a disordered mind. A phantom, a spirit, a ghost.
I don't know. It was little, brown, and low to the ground. You think when you die you go to heaven? You come to us.
Thanks for joining us tonight on the Fanatics of Film. Tonight we're going to discuss one of my favorite horror films of all time because it is the season, right?
Yes.
Scary Movie Month. 'Tis the season. So let's get into.
'Tis the season to be folly.
'Tis the season to be frightened. We're gonna discuss the 1979 Don Coscarelli classic that is Phantasm, one of the most commercially underrated, but as far as the mainstream, but within the horror community and independent film community, it's one of the most revered films of its era, and this thing just will not die. The film was released in 1979, written and directed by Don Coscarelli, who was one of the youngest studio working filmmakers in Hollywood at the time. Basically, for those who haven't seen it, we're going to
Ironically, he's still the youngest.
Yeah, he's still a lot younger than all my other heroes.
Kidding.
We're going to quickly give a quick review, so spoilers. Just for those who haven't seen it and maybe just tuning in to find out what we're talking about. Basically, it's a story of two brothers, a younger brother Mike and older brother Jody, and their good friend Reg, the ice cream man, the Reg man. Basically, figure out that up at the Morningside Cemetery where they're at, there are strange goings-on by the giant tall man, played by the late, great Angus Scrimm. That guy right there. Basically, a grave robber from another dimension, as it's been called. That still doesn't give it justice. This movie's got everything a young kid would want in a horror film. It's got violence and gore and language and nudity and flying balls that drill into your brain and killer undead dwarves and creepy caretakers and
flying balls of steel.
Yeah,
with drills built on them. Drills, or I mean, well, maybe they're just they just siphon and spew blood. They
just spew blood. That's all they do. Like the tagline says, if this one doesn't scare you, you're already dead. What can I say? Flippin' love this movie. Saw it when I was 12 years old. I'd seen the trailer for Phantasm 2 in the summer of '88 and didn't know what Phantasm 1 was. So I had to investigate because it just looked so cool. And this was when I was getting into modern horror films before Phantasm. I think all I could stomach was like Psycho, Night of the Living Dead, House of Wax, old school horror films that were a little softer and a little tame by late 80s standards. And Phantasm helped me get into it. And so I went to the video shop. I'd seen the video there hundreds of times, thought the artwork was always intriguing but a little creepy. Watched this movie and fell in love with it. Just absolutely. I think I watch it every October, sometimes even more during the year. I watch the entire series. I've seen the entire series so many times, but the first two Phantasms I've seen more times than I could possibly count.
So you saw the first one first, or did you?
Yeah.
Okay, and was that in the theater, or was
no?
that...
I rented it at the video shop because the second one was playing in theaters. It didn't play very long. It was a studio release, where the first one it's an Avco Embassy release, but it was still sort of independent. Where the second one was from Universal, but that and They Live, John Carpenter's They Live, came out the same summer, and they had the lowest budget of any Universal films released that year. But that doesn't matter because they were so cool. And I know Don Coscarelli is actually proud of Phantasm 2 because he told me that himself, and more of that later. But yeah, the second one was playing in theaters. I'm like, what is this? I've got to check this out. I need to see the first one, and rented the first one, and then probably 3 months later, I'd seen the first one maybe 3 or 4 times by that point. Rented the second one the day it came out on video. I still have the one sheet theatrical poster I got from managed to talk out of the theater, as well as the video release poster, one sheet that slightly smaller that was at the video shop. It's like, you got to let me have this once you're done with it. I remember taking that home and the movie, because once it came out, this video shop was already ready to put up other new release posters. And those two movies, they really got me into the whole world of the type of horror films I enjoy. Your Friday Nights and Halloweens and Friday the 13th and Elm Streets and Hellraisers and Child's Play, all that kind of fun stuff. And a few gems in there too, like The Unholy and Lair of the White Worm and things like that. But yeah, this movie just blows me away. Every time I see it, I get something new out of it.
And it's actually great because the first couple of times I've seen the first Phantasm just a couple of times, and you're kind of trying to figure out who your real protagonist is for a little bit, at least trying to figure out who it is. And it ends up being Mike. I mean, he's the guy. I mean, it's a 13-year-old kid, so he's your main. He ends up being the main guy who has to step up and become brave, and that's what I think the brilliance of this is, that there's all these sci-fi elements too, and interdimensional travel was a huge thing, of course, back then in the 80s, and apparently, with horror, especially with like Hellraiser and these interdimensional things. But I think, and of course, the setting of booby traps and the other classic things of the 80s, which the black muscle car that's involved in this as well.
The Hemikuda.
Yeah, but the main thing that I think that I took away from this is that he has to step up and be brave against something that's so utterly terrifying.
Well, it's such a hallucinatory story because I don't think Don Coscarelli had intended it to be a franchise. It was just sort of, which is why there was 10 years between Phantasm and Phantasm 2. Basically, it's the story of two brothers who lost their parents.
Wait, so there are 10 years in the story, or 10 years that it took for them to make this second movie?
Both.
Oh, okay.
The second film does take place 10 years later.
Okay.
It's kind of it's an interesting story because really, in a lot of ways, it's about a little kid who is worried that his parents are gone and his brother's thinking of leaving him with his aunt. And it's sort of, to me, it's kind of a story about a kid who's trying to reconcile with that. And this may or may not be a delusion caused by his anxieties. At least that was the original intention. Of course, with sequels, that kind of all changes. And
for someone just trying to deal with like the death of his parents, he ends up having to spend a hell of a lot of time in a mortuary. So,
yeah, and the cemetery. Well, and his parents, you find out. I mean, his parents weren't. They didn't just have an accident. They were killed because the Phantasm, the tall man's going around collecting all the new. He's killing people, taking the bodies, digging them up out of the graves, and sending them off to his little dimension where he crushes them. Where he crushes them here and to send them off to the dimension where he's from, so they can become slaves,
and not
basically.
Literally crushes them down to littler goblin-esque version of themselves.
Yeah, they become evil Jawas. They become little.
I said the same thing the other night.
Yeah, they're little Jawas. They're basically undead little dwarves going around killing people, and basically it's a slave. Like they figure out it's a slave labor force that He's taking the bodies, he's crushing them down to little size, and he's sending them to this other dimension where they're basically his slave labor.
And it's funny too because it's like you think about that too. It's like, okay, so they're smaller now and probably not as strong as they could have been when they're. No, anyway, what's the concept behind that?
The reason why they send them, and they mentioned that in the first Phantasm, is that it's the atmosphere in this other planet, this other dimension.
Okay, I hadn't caught that.
That's why all it's got the red skies, constant wind, barren landscape, and it's the only way that he can keep this slave force operating through. What I would imagine, because it's never fully been explained, but this alternate dimension must be sort of where the tall man is from and kind of his sort of headquarters, because as the series progresses, you find out there are multiple dimensions and timelines, and this tall man exists all over the place. And it just gets weirder from there. The fifth and supposed final one was released in 2016 from Welgo USA, and it had a limited theatrical engagement. And it's the only one that Don Coscarelli didn't direct. He did write and produce. He directed the first four, wrote and directed the first four. He worked with the gentleman who had done the visual effects for him on John Dies at the End. Angus Scrimm passed away, unfortunately, in 2016 before the fifth one came out. So they would have to recast him, and I think at this point nobody wants another. At least from what I understand from the fans that I've spoke to, and there are a lot of us ravenous Phantasm fans, and that's fan with a PH, by the way. We've all discussed this. I mean,
and you could also consider yourselves the Phantasm Menace.
Yes. Well, no. I can't speak for every fan, but the people I've spoke to, and there are numerous, we kind of all agree that with Angus Scrimm gone, we don't want to see somebody fill his shoes, and you can't really do a story in the Phantasm universe without the Tall Man. So as far as we're concerned, the original franchise is done. If they want to do a reboot and do a reinterpretation, I'm not overly keen on that, but if Don Coscarelli is somehow involved, I'd definitely give it a chance, because it's the only way you're going to have somebody to fill in those shoes, because this is not a character that has been portrayed by multiple people. He's not a character that just wears a mask. Angus Scrimm created this character, the Tall Man, one of the most sinister villains in horror history, as far as I'm concerned. He's right up there with Norman Bates and Michael Myers, Jason Voorhees, Freddy Krueger, Pinhead, Chucky, Pumpkinhead, and all Ghostface Killer, and all the classics.
Yeah, it's a shame that he's not discussed as immersed in pop culture as much as the others, but I think he's just as cool, or if not cooler.
Well, and it's kind of fun to find out who are fans of the Phantasm films. For instance, maybe you've heard of him, this guy named J.J. Abrams. Huge fan of Phantasm.
I was going to ask you, that's the next thing I was going to bring up, is like what made him decide to do this remastering? Is it just the quality of the film?
So
sorry,
JJ has been a fan of Phantasm, as far as I know, since he's a few years older than us, but as far as I know, he's been a fan since he was a kid, and he's shown his love in several ways. Of course, in Force Awakens, the character of Phasma is named. His name is in homage, plus the silver helmet that she wears.
Yeah, totally.
But Angus Scrimm, who played the Tall Man, was actually a semi-regular on his show Alias, during the first 2 seasons. And when I say semi-regular, I mean maybe 2 or 3 episodes a season. But I think he did more episodes than Quentin Tarantino, and Quentin Tarantino was actually an assassin on Alias for the first season, first 2 seasons. He was in, I think, a total of 4 or 5 episodes. Angus Scrimm was probably in about 6 or 7 episodes. And small parts, I mean, he was an elderly gentleman, but I think, when it finally came time for getting close to the 40th anniversary of Phantasm, and this was 2 years ago when Bad Robot remastered it, but it was getting close to the 40th anniversary, I think it was actually J.J. Abrams who, according to Don Coscarelli himself, it was J.J. Abrams who contacted him and said, hey, I would love to be able to do a remaster of Phantasm and get it to a limited release in theater, but let's bring it back to the big screen. What say you? And I think Don Coscarelli's first reaction is, this isn't JJ. Who? What? Yeah. Why would you be calling me? And I think then after the initial shock, it was like, wow, thank you. You're a fan. This is great. And I think that's pretty much how it went. I mean, it really wasn't complicated. JJ's a fan, and he said, let's give this a good treatment, because none of the other studios, I think, were looking to remaster. I mean, Phantasm 2 had already had a 2K remaster for the Scream Factory collection. Unfortunately, they couldn't get the rights to the first Phantasm or the third and fourth. They probably would have released those and remastered them themselves, but they wouldn't have gone to theater for the limited release. So that's pretty cool. And what I love about the remastered version, the only touch-ups that they did digitally to this is they removed some of the wires on the flying sphere. Now, you'd be hard-pressed to even see them. You'd have to actually pause it frame by frame to even see it in the original, because they painted them black, and with the background moving so quickly, I've never noticed them ever, even when they've been pointed out to me. But Don was just happy to just remove that from the image so that you can't see it at all. And other than that, there are no other touch-ups, no CG, anything. But it was remastered in 5.1 sound, because this film didn't come out that way. I don't even know if it originally came out in stereo. I think it was probably a mono soundtrack. And What's cool too is that it's got a brand new Bad Robot logo that you will probably never see on any of the other Bad Robot productions. It's not the robot popping up out of the forest. It's got that, but it's in circular. It's got this weird synth riff that's very 80s, and then they threw on the old Avco Embassy logo, which is how I originally remember seeing that on video and on HBO back in the day, where when it got picked up by Anchor Bay, you'd have the Anchor Bay logo in front of it, which is not nearly as cool, because it's the same logo that I would always see in front of films like Wes Craven's Swamp Thing, John Carpenter's The Fog, John Carpenter's Escape from New York. So just that bit of retro cool just made me happy. I think this is truly a horror classic.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I absolutely loved seeing the movie for the second time just a few weeks ago.